Rick woke up suddenly, his body tense, his breath shallow. The nightmare still clung to him, the faces of the people he could save at Miska University, the chaos. The memory of his once trusted ally, who had turned against him when things got tough, stung deeper than the blood on his hands. That betrayal had shattered something inside him, leaving him with a bitter emptiness that no victory could fill. With a frustrated grunt, Rick pushed himself out of bed and dragged his heavy body to the washroom. The cold water he splashed on his face did little to clear the fog in his mind. His reflection in the mind showed a man hardened by loss, betrayal, and the unrelenting weight of survival. He moved mechanically, heading to the bathtub, the steam rising as the water filled it. He sank in slowly, hoping the warmth would ease the tension, but it didn't. Nothing ever did. The betrayal still gnawed at him, a constant ache in his chest. After a while, Rick forced himself out of the tub, feeling numb. He shuffled to the couch, dropping onto it like a dead weight. The silence of the room was suffocating, but it wasn't the quiet that bothered him, it was the feeling of being utterly alone. He stared at the piano in the corner, the one thing that had always given him an outlet for his pain. Without thinking, Rick stood and walked over to it. He sat down, his fingers pressing lightly on the keys. The melody was slow, melancholic, reflecting the anger and grief that pulsed through him. Music had always been his escape, but today, it only deepened the ache in his soul. As the last note lingered in the air, Rick stood, his jaw clenched. The pain would never go away, not completely, but he'd learn to live with it. He wasn't going to let the betrayal destroy him. Instead, he would make his life harder, tougher, forcing himself to push forward. He would trust no one, fight for himself, and never let his guard down again. After the piano's final note faded, Rick's resolve hardened. He couldn't stay idle, trapped in his thoughts any longer. Grabbing his backpack, he rushed outside, headed straight for the railing. Without a second thought, he leaped, landing with a roll to cushion the fall. He didn't pause to catch his breath, his path was clear. He pulled out a collapsible bike from his pack, quickly assembling it, and pedaled hard toward the edge of the forest. His goal was the helicopter, a lifeline that would take him closer to the fall's secret path. As he reached the clearing, he spotted the camp near the wreckage. The helicopter, still intact, stood ready to take him further into the wilderness. The crew was preparing for the next leg of his journey. This was it, the fall forest awaited, and Rick wasn't turning back. The helicopter touched down, and Rick stepped out into the eerie stillness of the fall forest. Tall, twisted trees loomed overhead, their branches blocking out most of the light. The air was thick with mist and the scent of decay, and the ground was slick with moss and damp leaves. The forest was alive with distant groans of zombies, but the real danger lay deeper ahead. Eventually, the trees parted to reveal the narrow, shadowy entrance to the secret path. The air grew colder, and the oppressive weight of the forest seemed to close in on him. There was no turning back now. With a steady breath, Rick stepped forward, entering the dark and dangerous path that lay ahead. Rick checked his map, the route to the secret path clear but treacherous. He pushed forward, stepping over tangled roots and thick underbrush, the path barely visible as it wound through the dense woods. As he ventured deeper, the trees grew closer, and the silence grew more oppressive. Rick stepped into the dark, narrow passage of the fall's secret path, the stranger moving silently beside him. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The path ahead was barely visible, choked with thick vines and overgrowth. As they advanced, the way forward was suddenly blocked by a large pile of fallen rocks, an obstacle that would slow them down. At the edge of the path, they spotted an old generator, its metal frame barely visible beneath the vines. A faded sign nearby hinted at its function, to clear the path ahead. The generator, though old, could start the machinery that would remove the obstruction. Without a word, the stranger moved forward and began taking over the generator. Rick stood watch, his eyes scanning the darkness. The sound of distant groans grew louder, zombies were closing in. The stranger finally managed to get the generator running, the whirring of the engine cutting through the silence. But as the machine powered up, the sound echoed through the forest, attracting the attention of nearby zombies. Within moments, a horde of the undead surged toward them, drawn to the noise. Rick raised his weapon and began firing, taking down the zombies as they approached. The battle was intense, the sound of gunfire echoing through the woods. They fought back to back, cutting down wave after wave of zombies. But when the final boss emerged, a massive, mutated creature, Rick's weapon jammed. He fired the last shot, and the gun clicked empty. With the creature closing in, Rick quickly dropped to the ground, pulling a spare magazine from his bag. He swiftly reloaded his weapon, his heart racing. As the creature lunged toward him, he steadied his aim and fired, the blast taking down of the boss's health. The beast collapsed to the ground, defeated. Breathing heavily, Rick checked his ammo. It was low, but for now, the path ahead was clear. The generator had done its job, and the way was open. Rick and the stranger exchanged a brief nod, the next part of their journey awaiting them in the darkness. Rick and the stranger pushed forward through the dense, dark forest, the sounds of the zombies growing louder with every step. They weren't alone anymore. The undead had found them, their groans echoing through the trees. Rick drew his weapon, and with a quick motion, opened fire, taking down the first few zombies that staggered into view. Their bodies crumpled to the ground, but more followed, swarming toward them. Rick moved swiftly, methodically, keeping the zombies at bay as best as he could. The stranger, her eyes glowing with an eerie light, raised her hands. Dark energy pulsed around him, and the moment a zombie fell, its soul seemed to be drawn into her control. The fallen bodies became still, their eyes dimming as they were forced into an unnatural stasis. With each zombie that died, more were held back, the stranger's power keeping them in check. "Keep pushing," the stranger said, her voice low but firm. "We need to get through." They moved as quickly as possible, but with each step, more zombies appeared, swarming from the trees and underbrush. Rick's gunfire echoed through the forest, and the stranger's control over the souls of the fallen helped create a path for them. Together, they cut down zombies, leaving a trail of bodies behind them. But the sound of more zombies closing in grew louder. The stranger's control over the souls was not infinite, and it seemed the undead were starting to overwhelm them. They reached the entrance to the offense, a heavy metal door obscured by vines and debris. Rick reached for the handle, but as the door creaked open, the ground beneath them shifted. With no warning, they began sliding down a steep hill, the momentum too strong to stop. Rocks and dirt flew as they tumbled uncontrollably. The noise of the sliding and the chaos around them drowned out everything else. They landed hard at the bottom, tumbling into a pile of mud and debris. The sound of zombies was faint now, but Rick knew they hadn't escaped for long. The path ahead was far from safe. Rick and the stranger pushed themselves up, the remnants of their slide still clinging to their clothes. The groans of distant zombies echoed through the fall forest, but they were safe, for now. Ahead, a small clearing revealed a makeshift camp with torn tents and rusted fuel drums. The air reeked of gasoline, mixed with the dampness of the forest. Rick spotted a truck surrounded by a few wandering zombies. They had to refuel it and get out fast. "We need to move quickly," Rick said, eyeing the zombies. "Let's refuel the truck." The stranger nodded, her powers already at work as she controlled the nearby zombies, slowing their advance. Rick quickly filled the truck's tank from the fuel drums. More zombies closed in, drawn by the noise. "Hurry," the stranger urged. Once the tank was full, Rick jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the gas pedal. The engine roared to life, and the truck lurched forward, knocking zombies out of the way. The stranger continued to push the undead back with her powers, but it was clearly taking its toll. As the truck sped down the road, the chaos of the camp faded behind them. But Rick knew this was just the beginning, the fall forest still held many dangers ahead. After a long journey, Rick and the stranger's truck reached a desolate clearing, where a crumbling fortress stood. The air was thick with tension as they approached, knowing that the final boss awaited them. Suddenly, a massive figure emerged from the shadows. The last boss, an enormous, decayed creature, charged at them, its glowing mutant creature a formidable enemy. The stranger struggled to control the boss, but it was too strong. Rick fired at it, but the bullets barely had an effect. They fought back fiercely, dodging its powerful swipes. The stranger's energy was running low, but she managed to freeze the boss long enough for Rick to land a killing blow. With a final strike to its neck, the creature fell, its massive body crashing to the ground. The clearing was silent once more. Though the battle was won, the fortress still stood ahead, and their journey wasn't over yet. With the mutant boss defeated, Rick and the stranger stood in the silent clearing, catching their breath. The battle had been brutal, but they had made it through. As the dust settled, they knew the operation was nearly over. Rick checked his radio. "Helicopter's on its way," he muttered, knowing their extraction was imminent. Minutes later, the roar of blades filled the air. A helicopter descended from the sky, its rotors slicing through the forest's eerie quiet. They both climbed aboard, Rick looking back one last time at the dark fortress. The fall forest, with all its dangers, was finally behind them. The stranger, who had been quiet since the battle, looked out the helicopter's door, her expression unreadable. As the helicopter lifted off, she glanced at Rick. "This is where we part ways," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. Rick nodded, understanding. Their journey together had come to an end. The stranger had accomplished what she needed, and now she was going her own way. Before Rick could say anything, she turned away, her figure becoming smaller as the helicopter soared higher, heading toward a new chapter, leaving the fall forest and the chaos behind. Rick watched her disappear into the distance, then turned his gaze forward. The operation was over, but the world was still full of challenges, and he knew there was always more ahead. Rick climbed onto his bike, the engine rumbling to life beneath him. The camp had been quiet, a temporary resting place after the chaos of the fall forest, but now it was time to head home. The familiar dirt road stretched out before him, and the cool breeze hit his face as he sped away from the camp. As he rode, his mind wandered back to the mission, to the battles fought and the stranger who had left without a word. The forest was behind him now, but its shadows still lingered in his thoughts. The betrayal he'd experienced weighed heavily on him, old memories, old wounds that never truly healed. The bike hummed steadily beneath him, the tires kicking up dust as he weaved through the rugged terrain, heading toward the small manor that had been his home for what felt like a lifetime. The journey was short, but with each passing mile, Rick's thoughts grew heavier. He finally reached the familiar clearing. His house stood in the distance, simple, isolated, a place of solitude amidst the chaos of the world. As he parked the bike outside and dismounted, the weight of exhaustion settled in his bones. The adrenaline from the battle had worn off, and now all that remained was the ache in his body and the silence of the world around him. Rick looked up at the manor, feeling a brief moment of peace. But deep down, he knew that peace was fleeting. There were always battles to fight, both outside and within. For now, though, he needed rest. The bike ride home had been a short reprieve, but there was still so much more to face. He walked inside, closing the door behind him, and let the silence wrap around him. It was time to rest, but the ghosts of the past would always linger, reminding him that there was no true escape.